Romans chapter 12. We just got through reading a lengthy section in there. We'll be talking about that tonight as we continue this idea that we talked about this morning of the transformed life. This morning we mentioned that God is able to do that. He's able to change us. I think sometimes we really have doubts about that. We might look at other individuals and we see that steady progression and change, and we desire that, but we look at ourselves and we can't imagine that much has taken place. I think that it has. I think it has in a lot of people here at Central. So don't discount what God is able to do, but recognize that not only is He after us to make us change and able to supply in that, but He wants to see us do our part, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. Now, Romans 12, verses 1 and 2 we read this morning, as Paul writes about beseeching us, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice. That's an unusual thing when you think about it. Now, the Romans are used to seeing sacrifices, whether the Jewish background or the pagan background. But to think about it being a living sacrifice, that gets pretty cruel. But that's what he's asking for. It's that we keep on sacrificing in our life. Holy, acceptable, which is, it's a reasonable service, Paul says. That's the translation I'm looking at here. And then the part we're looking at here is, and don't be conformed to this world. We just, as a modern translation, say, don't let the world put you into its mold. It's got this design of how it wants us to be. And if you haven't noticed already, it's always changing. They always have a new idea of what we ought to be doing. They're evolving in their process, as some people describe. Because back some time ago they were this way, but today they're that way. Now our morality's changed. It's evolving, as if that's what you call evolving. But not with God. We're not looking for their world to change, to mold, and keep resetting us, but rather we're to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. So that comes because of a process that we continually allow God to affect us. It's a continual process of being renewed. It doesn't happen just one time. It's a sharing adventure. Look at verse 3 here as we see what's going on. Paul continues his thought here. He says, for I say, through the grace given to me, in other words, God's helping me to get this down, Paul says. It's not just inspiration now, but I've got to swallow this pill just as much as you. To everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly. One translation says here, the New King James, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Now he's going to talk about church and gifts and abilities here as he's leading up to it. But the mindset is we're looking to be transformed. We're looking for God to do this, and we ought to be thinking about ourselves. Not too high up here. I don't belong up here. I belong down here. I ought to be looking at myself and examining where I am and what I am. And recognizing that God would rather have me at this bottom of the rung of the ladder. So this idea, the sharing adventure, starts out with our opinion of others in comparison to ourselves. And most of the time it's us up here and others down here. God says, I want you to turn that around. I want you to think higher of other people and lower of yourself. Can you do that? Not an easy thing. But this idea of looking at the world differently and becoming different than the rest of the world starts by how we look at everything and everybody. It's not a me-first attitude like the world thinks. That's the mold they want you to get in. You owe it to yourself, and you're never, getting enough of whatever's out there. You're just in thinking this, or justified in taking that, or doing this, or behaving the way you want to, when rather God says, now I want you to rethink this process. I give you some new mindsets here, some laws, some directions, a code of ethics, morality that's so different than the rest of the world. You don't belong in that mold. Here's the way you think. And stop thinking of yourself up here. Put yourself down here. If anybody belongs up there, it's God, and then put the people underneath that. Think less of yourselves and more of others. That's part of our part there. Then verses 4 and 5, he talks to the church here, and he describes, like Paul does in another letter, in 1 Corinthians letter in chapter 12 also, this idea of how we're all part of a body. Look at verse 4. For as we have many members in one body, this is the church now, but all the members do not have the same function. Just makes sense. 2 hands, 2 eyes, 2 ears, mouth. My mouth doesn't do the work my hands do. Now there is a picture on the internet of Craig painting a church building down in Nicaragua. He's got the paintbrush in his teeth. He's trying to do it like this. But you know, there was some famous artist that was out there some time ago, and so he was just playing around with it. But normally the mouth has one function, the hand has another. Just makes sense. Now if you can't get that done that way, you go about trying to do it however best you can. But God has purpose in what He does, in giving each one of us our different abilities. Now that doesn't justify us doing something that is against God's law because we think, well, God's given me this ability, therefore I can do. No, we have parameters, every one of us. But with the abilities God's given us, we've got a wide range of things to do to glorify God, to build up the church. And each one of us are to do those things. We don't have the same function, he says here. So, verse 5, we, being many, all of us different ones, are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. That's just, we work together. I can't imagine a beehive where the bees didn't work together. Or the ants that seem to be able to get in and do so many damaging things to homes and yards and what have you. They work together. It's not because of their size. It's because they're an army. And they function together. They don't fight with one another. They work together. That's what the church is meant to do. So we're talking about that. So starting out, we have opinions. We look at ourselves being down here now and everybody else up here. And then number 2, then, we understand that we work together. That we've got a common goal. Our country is divided. I've listened to people in Latin America joke about the, quote, United States. And the guy goes, give me a joke. I mean, California, they don't act like people from New York, and the people I've talked to have been maybe both places. It was a sad thing when 9/11 hit here in our country, but one thing it did do was it caused us to rethink the importance of being united. Sometimes we hit some rough places in life, in our families or in the church, and it calls us to stop and back up and think about what we really are about. God wants us to work together. Goal there, common purpose. Now, as we do that, each one has their own part to do. We do it together, but verses 7 and 8 and 9 describes her. 7 and 8 here talks about, verse 6 even, having different gifts now according to the grace that's in you, given to us, let us use them. Just do it. If it's prophecy, and those were miraculous gifts that they had, then let us prophesy according or in proportion to our faith. If it's ministering or serving, in other words, let us use it in our ministry. And he who teaches in teaching, and he who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives. That's a gift. Liberality. Not everybody has everything, but some people have some things to give, and they do a good job at it. And then he goes on and talks about this whole idea of who leads with diligence, and he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. You don't think about some of those things actually being gifts, but some people are gifted at giving, or encouraging, or showing mercy. And you stand back and you go, wow, Gene Arnold, I remember back years ago, what a guy that could handle showing mercy. He just knew how to do it. So all these things God says he's given to us. And he means for us to use them. Do your part. Now there's a whole list of things here that describes not only the transformed Christian, as he begins in verse 9, but it tells us, I think, some items to shoot for. And rather than digging through, because time is not permitted, but rather important that we look at all this, is just kind of use these points as stepping stones or stairs to growth and the process. So starting in verse 9, what we read just a little bit early, the basis of it all, let love Be without hypocrisy. In the letter that Paul writes to the church at Corinth, who thought they had it together with their spiritual gifts, who thought they were really deeply spiritual minded, they totally missed the purpose of their spirituality. They totally missed the concept of the church. They were off base as far as what they were doing, as far as reaching out in the area. And their worship service, as the best we can tell from reading a few of the chapters in there, was more like a show to see who was better rather than reaching out and helping and encouraging one another. And so planted right there in the middle of that discussion about how to use the gifts and how to do things is that chapter 13 about love. We mentioned, as a matter of fact, this morning in our Bible class. If I speak with the tongues, Paul says in verse 1, if I speak with the tongues, these gifts they had back then, be able to speak this language and that language, and it only comes by sweat and study today, but back then it was God-given, and it had a purpose to be able to communicate God's will and for people to know it was God talking. But even if we could do that gift of languages, of men and of angels even, but we have not love in the process, he said it's like a clanging cymbal. Just a bunch of noise. Not fitting, not uplifting, not helpful in any way, rather noisy. And you kind of, like noise is, a lot of times you just kind of want to shut it out. Can you imagine? The guy said that's what it's about. And then he goes on and talks about all of these things that love really is. Love is patient. Love is kind. Doesn't boast. It doesn't behave rudely. It doesn't, and it goes on and describes all those things that we ought not to be doing, but obviously the reason he was using those terms is because it was exactly what the church was doing in the name of spiritual gifts, in the name of religion, in the name of serving God. And they had it way off track. And they weren't functioning together. So as we're looking at this whole idea of the transformed life, stop thinking like the world in the competition and rather think about what God gives us in this ability and measure everything we do with, am I doing this because it helps? Does this really demonstrate my love toward the church, toward the people? I think there'd be a whole lot less problems within the church if we just go back and keep reading verse 9. Let love be without hypocrisy. We could even jump back to verse 3. And don't think of yourself up here, but down here. That's part of that measuring stick. And as he goes on, he says, abhor that which is evil, cling to that which is good. Sounds like what a Christian ought to do. Then why does Paul write that? Because the tendency in living in this world is to do the opposite. That old nature that Satan allows us to mingle in our thoughts and processes starts swelling up, and sometimes we get into a bad attitude and we start doing just the opposite of what we should do. And so when we're loving, let's not fake it. Let's really do this. That's the idea of hypocrisy, in other words. And then go on and hate the evil things, not the good people, but the evil things that exist in the world. And hold on to what's good. And then verse 10, he kind of defines, I think, the whole process. And I think the rest of it really is, you could almost say, a basic description of what verse 9 is talking about. Be kindly affectionate one to another. Doesn't say to everyone, does it? But it is intending that in mind. It doesn't say, be selective. Just be nice to the people that are nice to you. Rather, he's dealing with a group of people that have issues with one another. And as they're receiving this letter, they're struggling over this very point. I've got to be kind with the guy over on this side over here, who came out of a pagan background, that's not the good Jewish background like me. Or the pagan looking over there and say, I've got to be kind of like that guy over there who thinks he's already got it together before he gets to church. And back and forth. Yes. Being kind to whoever, in whatever status. And the reason is we're doing this because, going back to that basic principle, giving or in honor, giving preference to one another. It's still this whole thing of, I've got to do something to lift up my brothers. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'm just thinking here. Pause for a moment and just think. How many of you all had a perfect week last week where somebody didn't do something to you? I mean, do we not live in the world? And do we not get beat down by things? Do we not feed off just what happens over the radio waves or the TV waves that really goes against Christianity? And in all this whole process, while the world is beating us up, let's do something different for one another, is what Paul's saying. Give preference to one another. Let the world do the beating up on themselves, but let's remember who we are as Christians. Let's have this mindset of, when I come here together, this is my refuge. I may have had a bad week out there, but when I come in the door here, it's a great place. That I can walk in here and know I'm not going to get beat up on it. Even if I have bad attitude, still, like, they're going to love me just the same. We don't want that, but that's kind of how it happens sometimes. And in the whole process, then we get transformed, because that's what God's intending for this to be. And so as we do that, verse 11, then we're going to need some help here. So we need not be lagging in diligence, but rather being fervent in spirit and serving the Lord. I didn't hear any fervent spirits. No, I'm kind of expecting that, really. Tom Henley occasionally, when he's here, the loud amens and stuff, he's trying to get fire going. He's saying, let's get behind this. He's hearing something good, and he's wanting something to happen. And I know we sit back, and it's not that we have to shout amen like that to everything, but the point is, God is saying, I want somebody, and I want a lot of somebodies involved in making sure we have things happening. That we just don't sit back quietly and do nothing and allow the world just to pass by. We're made to be different, made to stand out, unique in this world. And we ought to recognize that's what God has called us to do. And that's going to take diligence to stay with it. One day at it, or one moment at it, or 1 hour at it is not enough. It's going to take a lot. And as he goes on a little further, he'll talk in verse 12 about the patience needed. Rejoicing in hope and patient in tribulation, because it's going to happen. But we go into life with that expectation. It's going to take that. I'm not going to be able to make it if I think that all I've got to do is just sing some cute little kids songs and everything's going to be sing and be happy. Because it's not always that way. I don't think we're doing the kids an injustice by encouraging them in those songs. But rather, I'm saying, as we adults look at this, we recognize what the world's like, and what we need to do is in what's happening here is to make sure that we are prepared for that. Because there are going to come some rough days. But I'm going to be patient anyway. I know who's got charge in this world. So I may have some bad days and some bad years. But there's going to be a time I leave this life, and I'll be ready whenever God calls me. Meanwhile, I'll be patient. Some practical things he talks about here in verses 13 and following. Distributing to the needs of the saints, giving to hospitality. Now, those are pretty easy things to do. When you think about it, just be taking care of one another and being hospitable. But what a difference that makes. When people sit down and just visit with one another, eyeball to eyeball, you're talking to people, and in the natural course, conversation strikes up and you begin to understand one another. You hear some things that you might not know normally because you're just passing by in the halls and saying, "Hi, how are you?" "Fine, I'm doing great." But deep inside, you've got some hurts and some pains and some struggles. But hospitality says, oh, there's something more to it than that. And so I'm getting to learn this whole process. Rejoice with those who rejoice, verse 15 says, and weep with those who weep. I heard a preacher talk about sometimes we get that turned around and we rejoice with those who are weeping and we weep with those that are rejoicing. We don't want anybody to get over it. We're going to be sad about that. No. I'm glad when things are going good for my brethren. When somebody has a good day, and even if I had a bad day, it makes me feel like, well, between the two of us, we're doing better. Because I'm part of that same family. I'm going to rejoice with them. And if they're not having a good day, like visiting with Betty this afternoon, you do what you can. Sometimes it just sits down and just weep with her a little bit. You know, people need that too. You need to understand that people care. You need that. I need that. We all need that. And God's reminding us that this is part of just the natural process of being different in the world. Transform life. Well, verse 16, being of the same mind toward one another. Don't let your mind sit on high things. It's kind of what he mentioned back in verse 3. Associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. And then verse 17, real similar to what he says back in 14. I jumped over that on purpose, but it says, repay no one evil for evil. Back in verse 13, or 14 rather, it says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. It's you know, you hit me, I want to hit you back, but I want to hit you twice as hard is usually the feeling that we have. Because I was harmed, I'm going to pay you double. But that's not what God says. Rather, you turn it all around and you believe and behave differently. Now, this is part of the transformed life. The world looks at this and goes, you're crazy. You're going to get walked over that way. Well, it's not to say that we allow the world to keep on treating us like that, but we don't react to them in the same way. What a difference that attitude can make. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it's possible, not always possible in other words, but when it's possible, as much it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. That's a lot of work. Because that's not what we feel like doing a lot of times. Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. We're going to do all that we can to make life correct. So in this whole process of time, we're becoming more like Jesus. We're having that transformed life. And that's the goal ultimately, being like Jesus. So as we pick up with the rest of this in verse 19, it says, beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine. Don't quote it like that, saying it belongs to you. It's what the Lord is saying. The Lord says, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. Let God take care of those things. He does a much better job of meting out justice, of repaying, if need be, than we do. He's in that business and always has been. He's the judge. Let God take care of those things. In the process, while we're up to it, verse 20 then says, but if your enemy's hungry, then feed him. Sounds like something I heard Jesus say. Exactly. And if he's thirsty, give him to drink. A good friend of mine had a great opportunity to have a Bible study start up just because of that very attitude. But as we were living in Argentina as missionaries, the guy that lived across the street from a single worker within our group here began to spread rumors that he had women in and out of the house all the time. It just infuriated this guy, who went across the street and he talked to him. He said, I just was livid. And he said, why did you talk about me like that? He said, well, I just kind of assumed he's a natural guy out here would be doing that. Well, did you ever see anybody in? No, I didn't really, but he told the whole neighborhood that was going on. I guess rather than thinking he was having guys in and out of the house, he was giving him some kind of credit, thinking he had women in and out of the house. Craig really didn't want either one. He was named Craig too, by the way. And frustrated, he got together with one of the women in the group and worked out a good recipe for a cake, and he took it over to the guy's house. And he said, just wanted to give you this cake. And the guy's like, what for? He goes, well, the Bible says that I ought to be doing something good for you. He said, I don't feel like it, but this is what I ought to do. It just blew his mind. It's just like, you're not behaving at all like I'm expecting. Not only do you not have women running in and out of your house, but you're treating me nice when you ought to be aggravated. What a difference when we behave like Jesus. You know, Jesus made a difference. If we can have that transformed life, what a difference we can make. The whole thing comes down to verse 21. We started out with in verse 9 here about this idea of let love be without hypocrisy. And then you kind of cap it off with, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Just makes sense. We're not going to overcome evil with evil. Just won't happen. I like the passage that John writes about in his gospel. He's describing Jesus. In John chapter 1, verse 4 and 5, John says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. It just lit up people like you couldn't imagine. When Jesus came onto the scene, everything that people trusted in became okay. All the people that put their confidence in God felt like, I've got it together. And those that didn't were shaping up and recognizing, we've got to reckon with this man, who was more than a man, of course. In him was the life, and the light was the light of men. It changed everything around him. You couldn't be yourself anymore because you'd been with Jesus. And his personality and his persona and who he was challenged you to live and be different. Verse 5 then says, and this light shines in the darkness, and the darkness, now depends on your translation, did not comprehend it. And some of them say understand it, and some say overcome it. And I think all three are fitting. The Greek language kind of leaves you out depending on which one you fit in here. But every one of them describes what's Jesus. They couldn't figure out why Jesus was the way he was. They couldn't comprehend how he was. But in that whole process, they couldn't overcome it either. He came into the light. He brought light into the world, and they couldn't stop it. They couldn't overcome it. The power of the Son of God was moving among the people, and the transformation that he brought made such an impact they couldn't stop him. And that's what we need to be. Transformed in such a way, moving in the world, that the people just stand back and go, wow, that's it. They don't want to stop it. They want to see more about this. A transformed life makes a difference in the lives of other people. That's why we need to be about it. Makes transformed families and friends and work and so much more. It makes what God intended for this world to be like. And it starts with me and you. Think about it. Pray about it. Study about it. And live it. Tonight, if your life isn't right with God, opportunity to change, transformation. God can do it. We talked about this morning. The same power that said, peace be still, and calm the storm. The same power that said, let there be light, also can change your life. You hold the key. As we mentioned this morning, we're responsible for any barriers of not being transformed. But you can change if you let God have charge. Come, let me stand and sing.